Sir, I'm going to need you to leave. Now, this event is invitation only. The voice cut across the Memorial Plaza like a blade, sharp and theatrical, designed to carry. Captain Wesley Harmon stood with his feet planted wide, one hand resting on his belt, the other pointing toward the exit. His black security uniform was pressed to perfection, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his expression carried the particular contempt reserved for problems that threatened to embarrass him in front of important people. The old man at the rope barrier did not move. He stood with his weight shifted to his right leg, favoring a left that bent at an angle suggesting something had healed wrong a long time ago. His jacket was army surplus, torn at the shoulder, held together at the seams with what looked like fishing line in desperation. His boots were work boots, the soles separating from the leather, held in place with wire twisted tight. He had not shaved in weeks. His hands, scarred and weathered, hung loose at his sides. "I just want to see the wall," he said. His voice was quiet, hoarse from disuse, barely loud enough to reach the security captain standing 6 feet away. "Just for a moment. Then I will go." Harmon stepped closer, making sure the guests already taking their seats in the white folding chairs could hear every word. 400 people had gathered for the dedication ceremony. State senators, the mayor, military officers in dress uniforms with ribbons climbing their chests, families of the fallen clutching programs and tissues. And here, at the rope barrier 50 feet from the black granite wall, where 7 names had been carved with solemn reverence, stood a man who looked like he had crawled out of a drainage ditch. "These men on this wall gave everything," Harmon said, his voice rising. "They sacrificed their lives for this country. And you want to shuffle in here smelling like a dumpster and disrespect their memory." The old man did not flinch, did not step back, did not raise his voice. "With respect, sir," he said, "I'm not here to disrespect anyone." Something in the way he said it made Harmon pause. Not the words themselves, but the delivery, the quiet precision, the automatic formality of a man who had spent years addressing superiors. But then Harmon looked at the torn jacket, the wire-wrapped boots, the grime embedded in the creases of the old man's face, and the moment passed. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. And if stories like this one, stories about courage and sacrifice and the heroes hidden among us, speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten warriors in every community. Now let us continue. 30 feet away, seated in the third row of white folding chairs, Corporal Tessa Nguyen adjusted her dress uniform and tried to focus on her program. The dedication ceremony would begin in 20 minutes. General Whitmore was scheduled to give the keynote address. It was supposed to be a solemn occasion, a moment of remembrance for 7 Green Berets who had died in a classified operation 33 years ago. But she could not stop watching the confrontation at the barrier. There was something about the old man that did not match. The way he stood when the security captain addressed him, spine straightening despite the obvious pain in his leg. The economy of his movements, nothing wasted, nothing exaggerated. The way his eyes swept the crowd with a practiced awareness that seemed completely at odds with his circumstances. She had seen that look before, in the eyes of the senior NCOs who had trained her, in the veterans who came to speak at her unit about combat deployments. It was the look of someone who had been shaped by something most people could not imagine. Harmon was summoning additional security now, speaking into his radio with clipped efficiency. 2 more guards appeared from the east checkpoint, flanking the old man, creating a wall of black uniforms and hostile stares. "Last chance," Harmon said. "Walk out on your own, or we drag you out. Your choice." The old man's hand moved to his chest, touching something beneath his jacket. A small gesture, unconscious, the way a man might touch a photograph or a ring or a memory he carried everywhere. "I served," he said quietly. "Just like they did." Harmon laughed. The sound was ugly, meant to be heard by the well-dressed guests watching from their seats. "Let me guess. Special Forces. Delta. Maybe a Navy SEAL." He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a mock whisper that still carried perfectly. I have heard it all, pal. Every homeless guy with a camo jacket thinks he is Rambo. The old man said nothing. You probably do not even know what unit is honored on that wall, Harmon continued. Probably cannot tell me what operation, what year, what country, because you were never there. You were just a bum who wandered in hoping for a free meal from the catering tent. Still the old man said nothing. His eyes had moved past Harmon, past the guards, past the rows of seated guests. They were fixed on the black granite wall rising in the morning light, on the carved names that meant nothing to most of the people here, but meant everything to him. Get him out of here, Harmon ordered. The general arrives in 10 minutes. I want this cleaned up. The guards moved forward. One of them grabbed the old man's arm, not gently. And in that moment, as they began to push him toward the exit, they walked directly past the panel dedicated to Operation Silent Thunder. 7 names carved into stone. 7 men who had died in a wadi in Iraq in January of 1991. The old man's eyes found them. His step faltered. His breath caught. Because there at the bottom of the list, beneath the names of 6 men he had loved like brothers, was a 7th name. Staff Sergeant Ezra Calloway. Mia. Presumed dead. His own name, carved into a memorial wall, honoring a man that everyone here believed had been in his grave for 33 years. But what Captain Harmon did not know, what no one at that ceremony knew yet, was that some graves are empty. Some ghosts still walk. And one of the names carved into that black granite wall was about to speak for himself. The smell of fresh-cut grass drifted across the memorial plaza, carried by a breeze that held the first bite of autumn. It was a clean smell, a peaceful smell, the kind of smell that belonged to Sunday mornings and backyard barbecues and everything good about being home. But for Ezra Calloway, it was the smell of a desert night 33 years gone. The guards were pushing him toward the exit, their hands firm on his arms, but his mind was no longer in the plaza. The grass smell had unlocked the door he kept bolted shut, and suddenly he was back in that C-130, feeling the vibration of the engines through the metal bench, watching Nolan Birch check his weapon for the 15th time. January 15th, 1991. 7 Green Berets loaded with enough gear to survive 2 weeks behind enemy lines. Operation Silent Thunder. Deep reconnaissance. Find the mobile Scud launchers that were raining death on coalition positions and Israeli cities. Mark the coordinates. Call in the strikes. Get out before anyone knew they were there. Nolan had been team leader. Sergeant First Class Nolan Birch from Gatlinburg, Tennessee, a man who could navigate by starlight and shoot the wings off a fly at 400 meters. He and Ezra had enlisted together, trained together, bled together through 3 deployments. They were closer than brothers. They had saved each other's lives so many times that keeping count seemed pointless. You nervous? The memory of Nolan asked, his voice cutting through the engine noise. The memory of Ezra shook his head. We have done harder insertions. Nolan grinned. That is what worries me. Universe has got to balance the scale sometime. He had been joking. They always joked before drops. It was how they kept the fear manageable, how they reminded themselves they were still human beings and not just weapons pointed at targets. But the universe had been listening. A hand shoved Ezra's shoulder, snapping him back to the present. The plaza, the ceremony, the guards pushing him toward the barrier while Captain Harmon followed behind, still performing for the crowd. 3 days, Ezra thought. We had 3 days in that desert before everything fell apart. They had moved like ghosts through the Iraqi night, covering ground that should have taken a week in half the time. By day 3, they had located 2 Scud launchers and marked the coordinates for airstrikes. They were ahead of schedule. They were going to make it home. And then the Republican Guard Patrol had stumbled onto their position. Ezra could still hear the first shots, could still feel the sand kicking up around his boots as he ran for cover, could still see Rodriguez take a round through the throat and drop without a sound, could still hear Nolan screaming orders, directing fire, trying to hold the line while they retreated toward the extraction point. But the extraction point was 12 kilometers away, and there were only 6 of them now. Move, Nolan had shouted. I will cover. Move. The firefight lasted 47 minutes. By the end, there were only 2 of them left, Ezra and Nolan, running through a wadi, the sound of Iraqi voices echoing off the rock walls behind them. Nolan had taken the first round in the shoulder, kept running, took the second in the hip, stumbled but did not fall. The third round caught him in the lower back, and that was when his legs stopped working. Ezra had dragged him into a shallow depression, propping him against the wadi wall while he returned fire at the shadows, closing in from 3 directions. Magazine after magazine, until the barrel of his rifle glowed red in the darkness. And through it all, Nolan had been talking. "Listen to me," he had said, his voice wet and fading. "You're going to get out of here. You're going to make a home. And you're going to tell Rebecca I did not quit. You're going to tell my boy his daddy was brave." Ezra had kept firing. "We are both getting out of here." Nolan's hand had found his arm, gripping with the last of his strength. "Promise me. Promise me you will tell them." "I promise." Nolan had smiled then. That same grin from the C-130. The universe balancing the scales. He had pressed something into Ezra's palm. Cold metal. A compass. Brass, weathered, engraved with his initials on the back. His father had carried it through Vietnam. Nolan had carried it through every deployment since enlisting. "Get home," Nolan had whispered. "Tell them we did not quit." He died 90 seconds later, bled out in Ezra's arms while the Iraqi voices grew closer and closer. Ezra had buried him in that wadi, using his hands to move the sand because there was no time for anything else. He had taken the compass and the dog tags, and he had run. An hour later, they caught him. The guards pushed Ezra through the barrier, back into the public area beyond the ceremony grounds. Captain Harmon stood with his arms crossed, satisfaction spreading across his face. "And stay out," he said. "This is a place for heroes, not garbage." Ezra's hand went to his chest, pressing against the shape of the compass beneath his jacket. He had carried it for 33 years. Through 18 months in a prison that did not exist on any map. Through 200 miles of desert walked on a shattered femur. Through 3 decades of hiding, running, punishing himself for the sin of surviving. He had promised Nolan he would tell his family. He had promised he would go home. But when he finally escaped, when he finally made it back to American lines more dead than alive, he learned that home no longer existed. His wife, believing him dead for 18 months, had remarried. His daughter, 3 years old when he deployed, did not recognize the skeleton who appeared on her doorstep. And Nolan's widow, Nolan's son, they had already grieved. They had already moved on. They had already learned to live without the men who were never coming back. Ezra could not face them, could not look at Rebecca and tell her that her husband had died in his arms while he kept breathing, could not look at Nolan Jr. and explain why he was alive and Nolan was not. So he had run, turned down the medals, refused the debriefings, disappeared into a country that had already forgotten the war and the men who fought it. For 33 years, he had lived as a ghost, sleeping under bridges, eating from dumpsters, visiting memorials at night, so he could trace the names of his brothers without anyone seeing his face. 3 miles from here, under a highway overpass, a man named Raymond Okoye was probably wondering where he had gone this morning. Raymond was the closest thing Ezra had to a friend, a Vietnam Marine who had heard Ezra screaming names in his sleep and had never asked why. A man who understood that some wounds could not be explained. Ezra looked back at the Memorial Plaza, at the black granite wall rising in the morning light, at the 7 names carved into stone. He had traced those names 1,000 times in the darkness. Nolan Birch, Carlos Rodriguez, William Chun, David Moreau, James Whitfield, Samuel Odieno, and at the bottom, the 7th name, the name that should have been erased when he walked out of that desert alive. Ezra Calloway, Mia, presumed dead. He had traced those 7 names 1,000 times in the darkness. But today, in the light, with 400 witnesses watching him be dragged away like garbage, he would learn that his own name was carved right beside theirs. And soon, everyone else would learn that some names on memorial walls still have voices. Some ghosts still have stories to tell. Captain Harmon was not finished. He had removed the problem from the ceremony grounds, but the satisfaction was incomplete. 400 guests had witnessed the confrontation, and some of them were looking at him with expressions he did not like. Expressions that suggested doubt. expressions that questioned whether he had handled the situation correctly. He needed to make sure everyone understood that he was right, that the old man was exactly what he appeared to be, that Captain Wesley Harmon had protected this sacred ceremony from a vagrant who had no business being here. "Hold him here," Harmon ordered the two guards flanking Ezra. "I want to document this for the incident report." Ezra stood motionless between the guards, his eyes still fixed on the memorial wall visible through the gaps in the crowd. The 7 names, the 7 brothers, the 7 ghosts who had haunted his dreams for 33 years. Harmon pulled out his phone and began taking photographs. The torn jacket, the wire-wrap boots, the grime on Ezra's face and hands. Evidence of exactly what this man was and why he had been removed. "You know what I think?" Harmon said, circling Ezra like a predator examining wounded prey. "I think you saw the news coverage about this ceremony. I think you figured out there would be free food, important people, maybe a chance to panhandle some guilt money from families who lost their sons." Ezra said nothing. "I think you probably bought that jacket at a surplus store. Probably practiced a few military phrases. Thought you could walk in here and nobody would question you." The guests in the nearest rows were watching now, programs forgotten in their laps. Corporal Tessing Nguyen had risen from her seat and moved toward the barrier, something pulling at her that she could not name. "Let me ask you something," Harmon continued, his voice carrying across the plaza. "If you really served, where is your proof? Where are your discharge papers? Where is your DD-214? Ezra's voice was barely a whisper. "I do not carry them." Harmon laughed. "Of course you do not. Because they do not exist. Because you are a fraud. A fake. The kind of man who steals the valor of real heroes because he never had any of his own." One of the guards shifted uncomfortably. He was younger than Harmon, maybe 25, and something about this confrontation was starting to bother him. The old man was not reacting the way homeless people usually reacted. No anger, no desperation, no pleading, just that quiet stillness, like a man who had learned long ago that words were weapons and silence was armor. "Sir," the young guard said quietly, "maybe we should just let him go." Harmon spun on him. "Did I ask for your opinion?" "No, sir." "Then keep your mouth shut and hold him here until I'm finished." Ezra's eyes moved from the wall to Harmon's face. For a moment, something flickered there. Not anger, not fear, something colder. Something that made the young guard take an unconscious step backward. But then it was gone, and Ezra was just an old man again. Tired, broken, defeated. Harmon noticed the reaction and misread it completely. He stepped closer, emboldened by what he perceived as submission. "You know what that wall represents?" he said, pointing toward the black granite. "That wall represents 7 men who gave their lives for this country. Men who ran toward danger while cowards like you ran away from everything." Ezra's hand moved to his chest again, touching the shape of the compass through his jacket. "Men who sacrificed everything," Harmon continued. "Men who died in places nobody can even talk about because the missions are still classified. Men who were worth something." He leaned in close enough that Ezra could smell his cologne and the coffee on his breath. "You are worth nothing," Harmon whispered. "You are less than nothing. And the fact that you would try to crash a ceremony honoring Real heroes proves exactly what kind of pathetic excuse for a human being you really are." Corporal Nguyen had reached the barrier now. She was watching Ezra's hands, the way they hung loose at his sides despite the provocation. The way his fingers remained still when they should have been clenched into fists. It was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. And then she saw it. Harmon had grabbed Ezra's arm again, yanking it roughly as he positioned him for another photograph. The sleeve of the torn jacket rode up, exposing the weathered skin beneath. There was a tattoo. Nguyen's breath caught in her throat. She had studied military insignias as part of her training. She knew what the Special Forces arrowhead looked like. She knew the styling, the placement, the way operators wore their unit markings with a particular kind of pride. But it was not just the arrowhead that stopped her heart. Below the insignia, in faded black ink that had been etched into the skin decades ago, there were numbers. Coordinates: 33.3128 degrees north, 44.3661 degrees east. And beneath them, a date. 11591. She did not know what those coordinates meant. She did not know why that date had been permanently carved into this old man's flesh. But she knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that this was not a man who had bought his jacket at a surplus store. "Sir," she said, her voice cutting through Harmon's continued tirade. "Sir, I think you should stop." Harmon turned, his face reddening. "Corporal, I already told you this is not your concern. Return to your seat." "But sir, that tattoo, those coordinates. I think he might actually be what?" Harmon snapped. "A hero, a decorated veteran. Give me a break, Corporal. He is a con artist who watched too many war movies." He turned back to Ezra, but something had changed. The crowd was larger now. More people had gathered at the barrier, drawn by the confrontation. Some were holding phones, recording. Others were whispering to each other, gesturing toward the old man's exposed arm. Harmon felt the shift in attention, and it fueled his anger. He needed to end this, needed to reassert control, needed to prove beyond any doubt that he was right and everyone questioning him was wrong. "Those coordinates probably mean nothing," he said loudly, making sure the cameras caught every word. "Probably copied them from some website. Probably thought nobody would bother to check." Ezra's voice, when it came, was so quiet that only Harmon and the guards could hear it. "Those coordinates," he said, "are where I bury my best friend." Harmon froze for half a second. Then he laughed, shaking his head. "Sure they are, buddy. And I'm sure you have a great story to go with them." He grabbed Ezra's arm again, preparing to march him further from the ceremony grounds. But across the plaza, a black SUV had pulled up to the VIP entrance. The doors were opening. General Clarence Whitmore was stepping out into the morning light, his uniform immaculate, his silver hair gleaming, his chest heavy with ribbons that represented 40 years of service. And in exactly 4 minutes, Captain Wesley Harmon was going to learn why some tattoos cannot be faked, why some coordinates are burned into the memory of everyone who served, and why some old men in torn jackets are more dangerous than entire armies. Nolan Birch had been afraid of exactly one thing in his entire life. Not combat, not death, not the dark or the unknown or the enemies who wanted to kill him. Nolan had walked through all of that without flinching, had run toward gunfire while other men ran away, had made decisions in split seconds that would haunt lesser men for decades. No, the only thing that had ever scared Nolan Birch was the thought of his son growing up without knowing who his father was. Ezra stood between the guards, Harmon's voice washing over him like static, and he was not in the Memorial Plaza anymore. He was in a tent in Saudi Arabia, 3 days before the insertion, watching Nolan stare at a photograph like it held the secrets of the universe. The photograph showed a woman with dark hair and tired eyes, holding a bundle wrapped in blue. Rebecca Birch and Nolan Jr., taken at the hospital 2 weeks before deployment. The baby had been born 6 weeks early, as if he knew his father was about to leave and wanted to meet him first. "He has your nose," Ezra had said, dropping onto the cot beside his friend. Nolan had not looked up. "He is everything. He is everything. And I am about to leave him. You will be back in 3 weeks." Nolan's thumb traced the edge of the photograph. "My old man left for Vietnam when I was 2. Came back when I was 4. I do not remember what his face looked like before he left. I only remember what it looked like after." Ezra had said nothing. There was nothing to say. They both knew the risks. They both knew that every mission could be the last one. They had made peace with that years ago. But fatherhood had changed something in Nolan. There was a weight in his eyes that had not been there before. A fear that had nothing to do with bullets or bombs or the enemy waiting in the darkness. "If something happens to me," Nolan had said quietly, "I need you to promise me something. Nothing is going to happen to you." Nolan had finally looked up. His eyes were wet. "Promise me you will tell him who I was. Not the classified stuff. Not the missions. Just who I was. Tell him I could throw a football 50 yards. Tell him I made the worst pancakes in Tennessee. Tell him I love his mother from the first moment I saw her, and I never stopped, not for 1 second." Ezra had swallowed hard. "I promise. Tell him I was brave, even if I was not. Tell him his daddy never quit. You're going to tell him yourself. Nolan had smiled then, that crooked grin that had gotten them both into trouble more times than Ezra could count. Sure I am, but just in case the universe has other plans. He had pulled the brass compass from his pocket, the one his father had carried through Vietnam, the one that had guided 3 generations of Birch men through darkness. If I did not make it back, Nolan had said, give this to him. Tell him it got me home every time. Tell him it will get him home too. Ezra had taken the compass, felt the weight of it in his palm, felt the weight of the promise settling onto his shoulders. I will. I swear. 3 days later, Nolan was dead, and Ezra had carried that compass, that promise, that unbearable weight for 33 years. He had never delivered the message. He had never found the courage to look Rebecca in the eye and tell her that her husband's last thoughts were of her. Had never found the strength to hand Nolan Jr. the compass and explain that his father had been the bravest man Ezra had ever known. Instead, he had run, hidden, punished himself with poverty and isolation and the slow, grinding misery of a life unlived. Nolan Jr. would be 33 years old now, older than his father had been when he died, probably married, probably had children of his own, had grown up without ever knowing the full truth of who his father was and what he had sacrificed, because Ezra had been too broken to keep a promise. The sound of Harmon's voice cut through the memory, sharp and mocking. Are you even listening to me? Ezra blinked. The tent was gone. The photograph was gone. Nolan's face, young and scared and impossibly brave, faded back into the locked room, where Ezra kept all the things he could not bear to remember. I said, Harmon repeated, stepping closer, you're going to leave this area and never come back. If I see your face anywhere near this memorial again, I will have you arrested. Do you understand? Ezra understood. He understood that he was an old man with a shattered leg and a broken heart, standing 50 feet from the only place in the world where his brothers still existed. He understood that Captain Wesley Harmon would never know what those 7 names meant, would never understand the bonds forged in blood and fire and the desperate hope of men who knew they might not survive the night. He understood that he had failed Nolan, failed Rebecca, failed the boy who had grown into a man without ever knowing why his father had not come home. But he also understood something else. He was tired of running. 33 years of hiding in the shadows. 33 years of tracing names in the darkness and whispering apologies to ghosts. 33 years of carrying a compass that was never meant for him, a promise that had grown heavier with every passing day. Maybe this was why he had come today. Not just to see the wall, not just to touch the names one more time. Maybe some part of him, some small defiant fragment of the soldier he had once been, had known that today would be different. Maybe today was the day he finally stopped running. Ezra looked at Harmon, looked at the guards, looked at the crowd gathering at the barrier, phones raised, witnesses to whatever was about to happen. Then he looked at the wall, at Nolan's name, carved at the top of the Operation Silent Thunder panel, at his own name, carved at the bottom. 2 friends, 2 soldiers, one dead, one pretending to be. His hand found the compass beneath his jacket. He could feel the engraving through the worn fabric. The initials, NB, the date, 11591. Get home, Nolan said. Tell them we did not quit. 33 years he had carried Nolan's compass. 33 years he had run from a promise. And now, standing 10 feet from Nolan's name, being dragged away like garbage, he wondered if this was God finally calling the debt due. If this was his last chance to be the man Nolan had believed he was. If this was the day Ezra Calloway finally came home. The voice came from behind the barrier, rough and familiar, carrying the particular authority of a man who had earned the right to speak. Leave him alone. Harmon turned, annoyance flashing across his face. Another problem. Another interruption. Another person who did not understand that he was in charge here and his decisions were not open for debate. The man walking toward them was black, mid-70s, with a gray beard and eyes that had seen more than most people could imagine. He wore a faded Marine Corps cap and a jacket that was almost as worn as Ezra's, though slightly cleaner. His gait was steady despite his age, the walk of someone who had learned long ago that showing weakness was not an option. Raymond Okoye had followed Ezra from the bridge. He had watched his friend leave before dawn, moving with a purpose Raymond had not seen in the 3 years they had known each other. Ezra rarely talked about his past, rarely talked about anything except the weather and where to find the best meals and which shelters had open beds. But at night, when the dreams came, Ezra talked plenty. Names shouted into the darkness. Coordinates mumbled through clenched teeth. Apologies whispered to people who were not there. Raymond had heard enough to know that Ezra was carrying something heavy, something that had broken him in ways that could not be fixed with a hot meal or a warm bed. And when he saw Ezra heading toward the Memorial Plaza, toward the dedication ceremony that had been advertised on every news channel for weeks, he knew that today was going to be different. So he had followed, kept his distance, watched from across the street as Ezra approached the barrier and asked to see the wall, watched as the security captain began his performance, loud and theatrical, designed to humiliate. And now Raymond was done watching. "I said leave him alone," Raymond repeated, stepping through a gap in the barrier that the guards had failed to secure. "He is a veteran. Whatever happened to him, he earned the right to stand here." Harmon's face reddened. "Oh, wonderful. Another one." He gestured to the guards. "Get this one out, too." Raymond did not move. "I served 2 tours in Vietnam. I Corps, 1968 and 1969. I watched boys younger than your guards die in rice paddies while politicians argued about whether we should be there. And I am telling you right now that this man has seen things you cannot imagine." Harmon stepped toward Raymond, his patience exhausted. "I do not care if you storm the beaches at Normandy. This is a private event, and neither of you has an invitation. Now leave before I have you both arrested." Corporal Nguyen had moved closer, drawn by the confrontation. She was watching Ezra, watching the way he stood perfectly still while chaos swirled around him, watching the way his eyes kept returning to the memorial wall, to the names carved in stone, to something that seemed to pull at him like gravity. "Sir," she said again, addressing Ezra directly this time, "what unit did you serve with?" Harmon spun on her. "Corporal, I am ordering you to return to your seat." But Ezra was already answering, his voice barely above a whisper. 5th Special Forces Group, attached to Joint Special Operations Command for certain missions. Nguyen's breath caught. JSOC. That was not a term people threw around casually. That was not something you learned from watching movies or reading books. That was the kind of thing that only came from actually being there. "What was your MOS?" she asked. 18 Bravo, Ezra replied. "Weapons Sergeant." Later cross-trained as 18 Delta. "Medical." Nguyen felt the hairs rise on the back of her neck. She did not know what those numbers meant specifically, but she knew they meant something. Knew that the old man was speaking a language that only certain people understood. Harmon laughed, but the sound was hollow now, losing its confidence. "He is making it up. Anyone can memorize a few codes." Raymond moved to stand beside Ezra, shoulder to shoulder. The 2 old men, one black and one white, one Marine and one Green Beret, united in something that transcended their differences. "I have heard him at night," Raymond said quietly. "Screaming names, calling coordinates, begging someone named Nolan hold on." Ezra flinched. It was the first visible reaction he had shown since the confrontation began. The first crack in the armor of stillness he had wrapped around himself. Raymond continued, "I do not know what happened to you, brother. You never told me. But I know that whatever it was, it broke something inside you. And I know that you did not break easy." The crowd at the barrier had grown larger. 50 people now, maybe more. Some were recording with their phones. Others were simply watching, sensing that they were witnessing something that would not fit neatly into the categories they used to understand the world. Harmon felt the shift in the crowd's attention, felt his control slipping away. He needed to end this, needed to reassert his authority before the general arrived and saw this circus. "Enough," he snapped. "Both of you are leaving. Right now." He reached for Ezra's arm, intending to drag him toward the exit. But before his hand could make contact, another voice cut through the plaza. A woman's voice, sharp and urgent. "Captain Harmon." Elena Vasquez was rushing toward them, her heels clicking against the stone pathway. The event coordinator looked panicked, her carefully constructed schedule falling apart around her. "Captain Harmon," she hissed, grabbing his elbow and pulling him aside. "The general is here. He is walking toward the stage right now. Whatever this is, it needs to be over." Harmon straightened his uniform. "It is over. I am removing these trespassers." "Do it quietly," Elena said. "No more scenes. The cameras are already recording. The last thing we need is a viral video of security dragging homeless men away from a veterans memorial." She hurried back toward the VIP area, already composing apologies in her head for the dignitaries who had witnessed the confrontation. Harmon turned back to Ezra and Raymond. His voice dropped to a low growl. "You heard her. Quietly. Which means you walk out of here on your own, or I'll make sure you spend the next 30 days in county lockup for trespassing. Your choice." Ezra looked at Raymond, his friend, his brother in ways that had nothing to do with blood. The man who had shared his fire on cold nights and never asked for explanations. "Go," Ezra said quietly. "You do not need to be part of this." Raymond shook his head. "I have been running from my own ghost for 50 years, brother. Maybe today we both stop running." General Whitmore had reached the stage. He was shaking hands with the mayor, accepting a program from an aide, preparing to deliver his keynote address. In exactly 3 minutes, he would glance toward the barrier. He would see an old man in a torn jacket being pushed toward the exit. And something about that old man, something about the way he held himself, would unlock a door that had been sealed for 33 years. But first, Captain Harmon was going to make one final mistake. General Clarence Whitmore had given hundreds of speeches in his 40-year career. Eulogies for fallen soldiers, briefings for presidents, testimonies before congressional committees with the weight of nations hanging on every word. But this speech was different. This speech was personal. He stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd, at the black granite wall rising behind the rows of white chairs, at the 7 names carved into the panel dedicated to Operation Silent Thunder. 7 names he had memorized 33 years ago. 7 faces he still saw when he closed his eyes at night. In January of 1991, he had been a young captain assigned to coordinate extraction for a deep reconnaissance team inserted behind Iraqi lines. 7 Green Berets, the best of the best, men who had volunteered for a mission that everyone knew might be a one-way trip. He had failed them. The extraction helicopter had been shot down 12 kilometers from the rally point. By the time a second bird could be scrambled, the team had gone silent. No radio contact, no emergency beacon, nothing but static and the terrible certainty that something had gone catastrophically wrong. 3 days later, Iraqi state television broadcast footage of American military equipment recovered from a wadi in Baghdad province. Dog tags, weapons, a body burned beyond recognition, dressed in American combat fatigues. The team was declared lost. 6 bodies were eventually recovered through back channels, returned in flag-draped coffins to families who would never know the full truth of how their sons had died. The 7th man, Staff Sergeant Ezra Calloway, was listed as missing in action, presumed dead. Whitmore had written all 7 memorial citations himself, had attended all 7 funerals, had carried the guilt of that failed extraction for 3 decades, wondering every single day if he could have done something different, something faster, something that would have brought those men home alive. He cleared his throat and began his speech. "We gather today to honor 7 extraordinary Americans who gave their lives in service to this nation. Men whose courage and sacrifice remain classified to this day. Men whose families have waited 33 years for this moment of public recognition." His voice was steady, practiced, but his eyes kept drifting toward the commotion at the barrier. Security guards, a man in a torn jacket, another man in a Marine Corps cap, some kind of disturbance that Elena Vasquez seemed to be handling. He forced his attention back to his notes. Operation Silent Thunder was one of the most dangerous missions of the Gulf War. 7 Green Berets inserted 80 kilometers behind enemy lines with orders to locate and mark mobile Scud launchers for airstrikes. They knew the risks. They accepted them willingly. And when the mission went wrong, they fought with a ferocity that exemplified everything we mean when we speak of valor. At the barrier, Captain Harmon had made his decision. No more talking. No more delays. He was going to remove these two vagrants personally, and he was going to do it in a way that left no doubt about who was in charge. He grabbed Ezra's jacket with both hands, bunching the fabric in his fists, preparing to physically shove him toward the exit. The jacket tore. The worn fabric, held together with fishing line and desperation, split along the shoulder seam, exposing the layers beneath. The stained undershirt, the scarred skin, and hanging against Ezra's chest, visible now to everyone watching, a pair of dog tags on a tarnished chain. But not just one set of dog tags. Two. Corporal Nguyen saw them first. Two sets of tags, hanging together, clinking softly as they caught the morning light. One set was worn smooth with age, the engravings barely visible. The other set looked different, older, the chains slightly thicker. Harmon saw them too, but his brain processed them differently. More props, more costume pieces purchased at a surplus store to complete the disguise. Nice tags, he sneered, reaching for them. Where did you buy these? eBay. His fingers closed around the metal, and something in Ezra snapped. Not violently, not loudly, but completely. For 33 years, he had allowed people to push him, to mock him, to treat him like garbage. He had accepted it as penance, as punishment for the sin of surviving when better men had died. But the tags were sacred. One set bore his own name, his own blood type, his own service number. The other set bore the name Nolan Birch. The tags Ezra had removed from his best friend's body before burying him in that wadi. The tags he had carried through 18 months of captivity, hidden in the lining of his boots, protected with his life. No one touched Nolan's tags. Ezra's hand moved faster than anyone expected. Faster than a 71-year-old man with a shattered leg should have been able to move. His fingers closed around Harmon's wrist with a grip that made the security captain gasp. "Do not," Ezra said, his voice low and cold and absolutely terrifying, "touch those tags." Harmon tried to pull away. Could not. The old man's grip was iron, unbreakable, the grip of someone who had been trained to hold on when holding on was the only thing between life and death. The crowd at the barrier fell silent. The guests in the white chairs turned to look. Even General Whitmore paused mid-sentence, his attention drawn to the confrontation. "Let go of me," Harmon demanded, his voice cracking. Ezra released him. The movement was controlled, deliberate, a decision rather than a reaction. He stepped back, his hand moving to cover the dog tags, to protect them from further desecration. But the damage was done. His jacket hung open now, the torn fabric exposing everything beneath. The scars on his arms, thick and ropey, the kind of scars that came from wounds that had healed without proper medical care. The tattoo on his forearm, the Special Forces arrowhead with the coordinates beneath it. And on his wrist, barely visible beneath the grime, more numbers. More dates. More evidence of a life that could not be fabricated. Corporal Nguyen was staring. Raymond was staring. The crowd at the barrier was staring. Phones were raised, recording every moment. And at the podium, General Clarence Whitmore had stopped speaking entirely. He was looking at the old man in the torn jacket, looking at the way he stood, spine straight despite the obvious pain, looking at the scars, the tattoo, the dog tags, looking at a face he had seen in photographs 1,000 times over the past 33 years. A face that belonged to a dead man. The word left his lips before he could stop it. Just one word. One name. Barely a whisper, but it carried across the silent plaza like a thunderclap. Calloway. The name hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Calloway. General Whitmore was moving before his brain fully processed what his eyes were seeing. He stepped away from the podium, ignoring the confused murmurs from the dignitaries, ignoring his aide who was reaching for his arm, ignoring everything except the impossible figure standing at the barrier 50 feet away. It cannot be him. Ezra Calloway was dead, had been dead for 33 years. Whitmore had written the memorial citation himself, had stood at the empty casket ceremony, had personally handed the folded flag to Calloway's ex-wife while she wept for a man who would never come home. But the face, the bearing, the way the old man held himself even in the midst of chaos. Whitmore had stared at photographs of the Operation Silent Thunder team for 3 decades, had memorized every feature, every detail, every smile frozen in time before the mission that killed them. He knew Ezra Calloway's face better than he knew his own children's faces. And that face was looking back at him now. "Sir," his aide said, hurrying to keep up. "Sir, your speech." "The ceremony." Whitmore did not slow down. "Cancel it." "Sir." "I said cancel it." The crowd parted before him. 400 guests watching the keynote speaker abandon his podium and march toward a confrontation that none of them understood. The mayor looked confused. The senator looked annoyed. Elena Vasquez looked like she was about to have a stroke. But Whitmore saw none of them. He saw only the old man at the barrier, the torn jacket, the exposed dog tags, the scars that told a story of suffering beyond imagination. Captain Harmon stepped forward, trying to intercept him. "General, sir, I apologize for the disturbance. These men are trespassers. I was just removing them from the premises." Whitmore stopped, looked at Harmon. The security captain withered under his gaze. "Step aside, Captain." "Sir, this man is clearly disturbed. He claims to be a veteran, but he has no documentation, no proof of service. He is just a homeless vagrant trying to crash the ceremony." Whitmore's voice dropped to a temperature that could freeze water. "I said step aside." Harmon stepped aside. The general moved past him, past the guards, past Raymond Okoye, who watched with tears already forming in his eyes. He stopped 3 feet from Ezra Calloway and stared at the face of a ghost. "Staff Sergeant Calloway," he said. His voice cracked on the words. "Operation Silent Thunder." Ezra met his eyes. 33 years since anyone had called him by rank. 33 years since anyone had spoken that operation name to his face. 33 years of hiding, and now a 2-star general was standing in front of him, looking at him like he was seeing a miracle. "It has been a long time," Ezra said quietly. "Captain Whitmore." Whitmore flinched at the old rank. He had been a captain in 1991. Young, ambitious, certain that he could save everyone if he just worked hard enough. He had been wrong. "You were dead," Whitmore said. "We recovered remains. We buried someone in Arlington with your name on the headstone. Iraqi prisoner." Ezra's voice was flat, reciting facts that had lost their power to hurt him decades ago. "Died in the cell next to mine. They dressed him in my uniform. Wanted to make sure the Americans thought the whole team was gone." Whitmore's face went pale. "The cell. You were captured. 18 months. Ezra touched his forearm, where the scars disappeared beneath his sleeve. "Facility outside Tikrit. Does not exist on any map." The crowd had gone completely silent. 400 people straining to hear every word. Phones raised, recording history being made. "And you escaped," Whitmore said. "You walked out of there." "Walked" is generous. Ezra's hand moved to his left leg, the one that bent wrong, the one that had never healed properly. "Crawled mostly. Took me 3 weeks to reach friendly lines. By then, everyone had moved on. War was over. Everyone I knew thought I was dead." Whitmore's eyes glistened. "We'll look for you. After you were reported alive, I launched a search. We spent months trying to find you. I did not want to be found." The words hung between them. The confession of a man who had chosen disappearance over homecoming. Isolation over recognition. Punishment over peace. "Why?" Whitmore asked. "You were a hero. You survived something that should have killed you. Why did you run?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment. His hand moved to his chest, pressing against the dog tags hidden beneath his torn shirt. 2 sets. His own and Nolan's. "Because I was supposed to die with them," he said finally. "Because I promised Nolan I would tell his family what happened. Because when I finally got home, I could not look at his widow, could not look at his son, could not explain why I was breathing when he was not." Raymond stepped forward and placed a hand on Ezra's shoulder. The touch was gentle, grounding, the touch of a brother who understood. "I ran," Ezra continued. "Turned down the medals. Refused the debriefings. Disappeared. It was easier than facing the people I had failed." Whitmore shook his head. "You did not fail anyone. You survived. You carried those men's memory for 33 years. I carried their ghosts," Ezra corrected. "That is not the same thing." The general looked at the old man before him. The torn jacket, the weathered skin, the eyes that had seen hell and had never fully returned. Then he turned to look at the memorial wall, at the 7 names carved in black granite, at the 7th name, the one at the bottom of the list. Staff Sergeant Ezra Calloway. Mia, presumed dead. He turned back to Ezra. You came here today to see the wall, Whitmore said. To see their names. Ezra nodded. Then let me take you to them. He extended his hand. Not a handshake, an invitation, an offer to walk together toward the place where the dead were remembered and the living came to mourn. Ezra looked at the hand, looked at the wall, looked at the crowd of witnesses who would soon know everything. For 33 years, he had hidden in the shadows, watched ceremonies from a distance, traced names in the darkness when no one could see. But today, in the light, with cameras recording and witnesses watching, Ezra Calloway made a choice. He took the general's hand, and together they walked toward the wall. The crowd parted before them like water before the prow of a ship. 400 guests rising from their white folding chairs, stepping aside, creating a path from the barrier to the black granite wall. Some were confused, whispering questions to their neighbors. Others were beginning to understand, their faces shifting from curiosity to something deeper. Something like awe. General Whitmore walked slowly, matching his pace to Ezra's damaged leg. The limp was pronounced now, each step a visible effort, but Ezra did not falter. He had walked 200 miles on that shattered femur 33 years ago. He could walk 50 more feet. Raymond followed a few steps behind, his Marine Corps cap clutched against his chest. Corporal Nguyen had moved to flank them, her training taking over, creating an honor guard that no one had ordered, but everyone understood. Captain Harmon stood frozen at the barrier, his face the color of ash. His mouth opened and closed, searching for words that would not come. The 2 guards beside him had stepped back, distancing themselves from their commander, from whatever was about to unfold. Elena Vasquez had abandoned her clipboard. The mayor had forgotten his prepared remarks. The senator had lowered the phone he had been using to check emails. Every eye in the plaza was fixed on the old man in the torn jacket walking toward the memorial wall. They reached the base of the black granite. The morning sun had warmed the stone, and Ezra could feel the heat radiating from it as he approached. 7 panels, each dedicated to a different classified operation. Names and dates and ranks carved with precision that would last for centuries. The Operation Silent Thunder panel was in the center. Whitmore stopped at the edge, giving Ezra space. This moment belonged to him. This moment had been 33 years in the making. Ezra stepped forward alone. His fingers trembled as he raised his hand toward the stone. The names blurred through the tears he had not realized were falling. Sergeant First Class Nolan Birch. Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez. Sergeant William Chun. Staff Sergeant David Moreau. Sergeant James Whitfield. Staff Sergeant Samuel Odieno. 6 names. 6 brothers. 6 men who had followed him into the darkness and never returned. And at the bottom, the 7th name. His name, Staff Sergeant Ezra Calloway. Mia, presumed dead. He touched Nolan's name first, traced the letters with a finger that had done the same thing 1,000 times in the darkness, when no one was watching, when the memorial was closed and the only witnesses were the stars. But this was different. This was daylight. This was public. This was real. I am sorry, he whispered. The words were meant for Nolan alone, but in the silence of the plaza, they carried. I am sorry I did not come sooner. I am sorry I ran. His finger moved to the next name. Carlos Rodriguez, the youngest of the team, 22 years old, had carried a photograph of his girlfriend everywhere, showed it to anyone who would look. He touched each name in turn. William Chun, who had grown up in San Francisco and dreamed of opening a restaurant when he got home. David Moreau, who could field strip any weapon blindfolded and quoted poetry during downtime. James Whitfield, who had 3 kids and coached Little League between deployments. Samuel Odieno, whose parents had immigrated from Kenya and cried with pride when he earned his Green Beret. 6 men, 6 lives, 6 futures that had ended in a wadi in Iraq, while Ezra kept breathing. I carried you, he said louder now. Every day, every night, I carried you with me. His hand moved to his own name. The letters felt strange under his fingers. His own memorial, his own headstone, the official record of his death, carved in stone for the world to see. "But I'm still here," he said. His voice broke on the words. "I'm still here, and I do not know why." General Whitmore stepped forward, standing beside him at the wall. His voice was quiet but steady. "You are here because you survived," he said, "because you endured something that would have broken anyone else, because you carried their memory when no one else could." Ezra shook his head. "I failed them. I was supposed to protect them, and they died. They died because the mission went wrong," Whitmore said. "They died because war is chaos, and chaos does not care about promises or plans. You did not fail them, Sergeant. You honored them. Every day you kept breathing, you honored them." The crowd was weeping now. Families of fallen soldiers who understood the weight of survivors' guilt. Veterans who had carried their own ghosts home from their own wars. Strangers who had never served but recognized something universal in the old man's grief. Raymond stepped forward, his weathered face streaked with tears. "I told you, brother. I told you there was something in you that did not break easy." Ezra turned to look at his friend, the man who had shared his fire on cold nights, the man who had heard him screaming and never asked why. "You never asked," Ezra said. "All these years, you never asked who I was." Raymond shook his head. "Did not need to. Knew you were one of us. Knew you were carrying something heavy. That was enough." Corporal Nguyen approached, her posture rigid with military bearing. She stopped 2 paces away and snapped to attention. Her hand rose in a salute that was textbook perfect. "Sergeant Calloway," she said, "it is an honor." Ezra stared at her, at the young soldier in her dress uniform, saluting a homeless man in a torn jacket, at the crowd behind her, many of them rising to their feet, at the phones still recording, documenting a moment that would soon spread across the world. He did not know how to respond, had not been saluted in 33 years, had not been called by his rank, had not been treated as anything other than garbage to be swept away. But somewhere deep inside, in a place he had thought was dead, something stirred. The soldier he had been, the man Nolan had believed in, the warrior who had survived hell and walked 200 miles on a shattered leg because giving up was not an option. His spine straightened, his shoulders squared, his hand came up slowly, trembling but steady, returning the salute. And for the first time in 33 years, Staff Sergeant Ezra Calloway stopped being a ghost and started being a man again. The salute held for 3 heartbeats. Then Corporal Nguyen lowered her hand and stepped back, her eyes glistening. But the moment was not over. It was just beginning. General Whitmore turned to face the crowd. For 100 guests standing in silence, waiting, sensing that what they were witnessing was more than a ceremony. It was a resurrection. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitmore said, his voice carrying across the plaza without need of a microphone. "I came here today to honor 7 men who gave their lives in Operation Silent Thunder. 7 Green Berets who died behind enemy lines in January of 1991. He paused, letting the words settle. "I was wrong." The crowd shifted. Confused murmurs rippled through the rows. 6 men died in that operation, Whitmore continued. 6 heroes who deserve every honor we can give them. But the 7th man, the man whose name is carved at the bottom of that panel, did not die. He survived. He was captured. He endured 18 months of imprisonment in a facility that does not exist on any official record. And when he finally escaped, when he finally made it home, he discovered that the country he had served had already buried him. Whitmore turned to look at Ezra, who stood motionless before the wall. Staff Sergeant Ezra Calloway chose to remain dead, chose to disappear rather than accept recognition he did not believe he deserved. For 33 years, he has lived in the shadows, carrying the memory of his fallen brothers, punishing himself for the crime of surviving. The general's voice hardened. Today, a security officer tried to remove him from this ceremony because of his appearance, called him a fraud, mocked his service, demanded he prove his worth. Every eye in the crowd turned toward Captain Harmon, who seemed to shrink under the collective gaze. "But the truth does not require proof," Whitmore said. "The truth is standing right here." The truth is carved into his skin in scars that no one should ever have to carry. The truth is hanging around his neck in dog tags that bear not only his name, but the name of the man who died in his arms. Ezra's hand moved to his chest, to the two sets of tags, his and Nolan's. Whitmore faced him directly. "Sergeant Calloway, I know you came here today just to see the wall, just to touch their names. But I'm asking you now, in front of everyone here, to tell us what happened. Tell us what you endured. Tell us why those coordinates are tattooed on your arm and what they mean." Ezra was silent for a long moment. The weight of 33 years pressed down on him. All the things he had never said, all the words he had swallowed, all the screams he had buried in the darkness. Then he spoke. 33.3128 degrees north. 44.3661 degrees east. His voice was quiet at first, barely audible. But as he continued, it gained strength. Baghdad Province. January 18th, 1991. Approximately 0300 hours. The numbers fell from his lips with the precision of an after-action report. Facts stripped of emotion, delivered with the cold clarity of a soldier recounting a mission. We had been on the ground for 3 days, inserted by helicopter 80 kilometers behind enemy lines. Mission was to locate mobile Scud launchers and mark coordinates for airstrikes. We found 2 sites on day 1. Marked them. Watched them burn. He paused, his eyes fixed on the names before him. Day 3. We were moving toward the extraction point. Republican Guard Patrol found our position by accident. Wrong place, wrong time. They had a company. We had 7 men. The crowd had gone completely still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Rodriguez went down first, round through the throat. Never made a sound. Then Chun took a burst trying to cover our retreat. Morrow got hit pulling Chun into cover. Died trying to save a man who was already gone. His voice cracked, but he kept going. Whitfield and Odieno held a position for 6 minutes so the rest of us could fall back. I watched them go down from 300 meters. Watched and could not do anything but run. Tears were flowing freely now down the faces of the guests, the veterans, the families who knew this story in their bones, even if they had never heard these specific words. Nolan and I made it to a wadi. Thought we might have a chance. Then the RPG came. Ezra's hand touched Nolan's name on the wall. He took 3 rounds. Kept moving. Kept fighting. Kept telling me to run. He gave me his compass. The one his father carried in Vietnam. Told me to get home. Told me to tell his wife and son that he did not quit. His finger traced the carved letters. He died in my arms at 0347 hours. Bled out in 90 seconds. I buried him with my hands because there was no time for anything else. Took his tags. Took his compass. And then I ran. "The coordinates on your arm," Whitmore said softly. "That is where you buried him." Ezra nodded. "I go back every night in my dreams. Every single night for 33 years. I dig him up and I bury him again, and I tell him I'm sorry, and he tells me it was not my fault. And then I wake up under whatever bridge I'm sleeping under, and I know that it was." He turned to face the crowd. 400 faces staring back at him. Some he recognized from the newspapers. Politicians, generals, important people in important clothes. But most of them were just people. Families, veterans, men and women who had never fired a weapon, but understood sacrifice in their own ways. "They captured me an hour after Nolan died," he said. 18 months in a hole in the ground. They wanted to know about the mission, about our capabilities, about other operations. He held up his hands, the scars on his fingers, the missing tip of his left pinky. I did not tell them anything, not one word. Every day they came with new questions and new tools, and I gave them nothing. His voice dropped. When I finally escaped, when I finally walked out of that desert, I thought the hard part was over. I was wrong. The hard part was coming home to a country that had already moved on, coming home to a wife who had remarried, coming home to a daughter who did not know my face, coming home to a grave with my name on it, and realizing that Staff Sergeant Ezra Calloway was already dead. He looked at the wall one more time. So I let him stay dead. Let myself become a ghost. It was easier than facing what I had lost. Easier than keeping the promise I made to Nolan. His hand found the compass beneath his shirt. But I never forgot. and I never stopped carrying them with me. Every single day, every single night. The silence that followed was absolute. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a sound began. Slow, deliberate, applause. One person at first, then two, then a dozen, then 400 people on their feet, clapping, weeping, honoring a man who had spent 33 years believing he deserved nothing. The applause rolled across the plaza like thunder, wave after wave of sound crashing against the black granite wall. 400 people on their feet, clapping until their palms burned, weeping openly without shame. Ezra stood frozen before the memorial, overwhelmed by a response he had never imagined and did not know how to accept. For 33 years, the only sounds that had followed him were the shuffle of his own boots on pavement and the whispered curses of people who wished he would disappear. This was something else entirely. This was recognition. This was honor. This was everything he had spent 3 decades running from. General Whitmore stepped to his side, placing a hand on his shoulder. The touch was gentle but firm, grounding him in the present moment. You carried them alone for 33 years, Whitmore said, his voice cutting through the applause. You do not have to carry them alone anymore. The clapping gradually subsided, replaced by a charged silence. People were wiping their eyes, collecting themselves, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Then a new voice cut through the quiet. Dad. The word was barely a whisper, but it carried across the plaza with the force of scream. Ezra turned. A woman was pushing through the crowd, her face streaked with tears, her hands trembling at her sides. She was in her 40s, with dark hair going gray at the temples and eyes that Ezra would have recognized anywhere because they were his eyes, the same shape, the same color, the same depth. His daughter, the 3-year-old he had left behind. The child who had not recognized him when he came home from the dead. The woman who had grown up without a father because he had been too broken to stay. Sarah. The name came out cracked, fractured, barely human. She stopped 10 feet away, close enough to touch, but held back by 33 years of absence. Her chest heaved with sobs she was trying to control. I saw it on news, she said. They were showing footage from the ceremony. And I saw your face. I saw you standing at the barrier, and I knew. I knew it was you. Ezra could not move, could not breathe, could not believe that she was here, that she had come, that after everything he had done she was standing in front of him. Sarah, he said again. I am so sorry. I never meant to. She closed the distance in 3 steps and threw her arms around him. The impact nearly knocked him off his damaged leg. He stumbled, but did not fall, his arms coming up instinctively to catch her, to hold her, to grip her with a desperation that surprised them both. She was crying into his chest, her words muffled by the torn fabric of his jacket. I looked for you. We all looked for you. Mom remarried, but she never stopped looking. When she died 3 years ago, your picture was still in her wallet. Ezra's knees buckled. Only Sarah's grip kept him upright. Your mother is gone. 3 years ago. Cancer. She made me promise to keep looking. Made me promise to find you and tell you she understood. She understood why you left. The words hit him like bullets, each one tearing through defenses he had spent decades building. His wife. The woman he had loved. The woman he had abandoned because he could not face her after everything he had lost. She knew, Sarah continued. She knew you were not running from us. You were running from yourself, and she never blamed you. Not once. Ezra was weeping now, great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. 33 years of grief pouring out of him in a flood that could not be stopped. I wanted to come back, he choked out. Every day, I wanted to come back. But I thought you were better off without me. Thought I would only bring you pain. Sarah pulled back just far enough to look at his face. Her hands came up to cup his weathered cheeks, to wipe away tears that would not stop falling. You were wrong, she said. We needed you. I needed my father. And you were out here alone, suffering, when you could have been home. I did not think I deserved a home anymore. Everyone deserves a home, Dad. Everyone deserves a family. Even ghosts. The crowd watched in silence, bearing witness to a reunion that felt too private for public consumption, but too beautiful to look away from. Raymond stood at the edge of the gathering, tears streaming down his face, his Marine Corps cap pressed against his heart. General Whitmore had stepped back, giving the family space, but his own eyes glistened with tears he did not bother to hide. Corporal Nguyen stood at attention, her salute held long past the point of protocol, honoring not just the soldier, but the father, the husband, the man who had finally stopped running. And at the barrier, Captain Wesley Harmon watched the scene unfold with a face gone slack with horror. The man he had called garbage. The man he had mocked and threatened and tried to throw away. That man had a daughter who loved him, had a wife who would never stop searching, had a story that would be told long after Harmon's name was forgotten. Sarah turned slightly, keeping one arm around her father, and gestured toward the crowd. "There is someone else who needs to meet you," she said. A young woman stepped forward from the gathering. She was in her early 20s with dark hair and Ezra's eyes, the resemblance unmistakable across 3 generations. "Dad," Sarah said, "this is my daughter, your granddaughter, Nolan." Ezra stopped breathing. "I named her after the story you used to tell," Sarah explained. "Before you left, you used to tell me about your best friend, about a man named Nolan who was the bravest person you ever knew. And when she was born, I wanted her to carry that name, so you would know, if you ever came back, that we remembered, that we never forgot." The young woman named Nolan stepped forward, tears running down her cheeks. "Hi, Grandpa," she said. And Ezra Calloway, the man who had survived 18 months of torture without breaking, the man who had walked 200 miles on a shattered leg, the man who had carried 6 ghosts for 33 years without bending, finally and completely fell apart. His legs gave out. He sank to his knees on the stone plaza, his granddaughter's name echoing in his ears, his daughter's arms still wrapped around him, the weight of 3 decades of isolation shattering into a million pieces around him. He wept like a child, and for the first time in 33 years, he was not alone. The plaza had transformed into something sacred. 400 people stood in reverent silence as Ezra knelt on the stone, his daughter and granddaughter wrapped around him. 33 years of isolation dissolving in the warmth of arms he had never expected to feel again. General Whitmore watched for a long moment, then turned to survey the crowd. His gaze found Captain Harmon still standing at the barrier, frozen in place, his face a mask of dawning horror. The general walked toward him with slow, deliberate steps. "Captain Harmon," he said, his voice carrying just far enough for the nearby witnesses to hear. "Do you understand what you did today?" Harmon's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Sir, I was just doing my job. I had no way of knowing. You had every way of knowing." Whitmore's voice was quiet, but sharp as a blade. "You looked at a man and saw only what was on the surface. You saw torn clothes and a limp and decided he was worthless. You mocked him, threatened him, put your hands on him. You tried to remove a Silver Star recipient from a memorial bearing his own name." Harmon's face went white. Silver Star, among other decorations. Whitmore stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. This man endured 18 months of torture without revealing a single piece of classified information. He walked 200 miles through hostile territory on a shattered femur. He has more courage in his smallest finger than you will ever have in your entire body. "Sir, I did not." "You did." Whitmore cut him off. "You did exactly what you meant to do. You saw someone you consider beneath you, and you made a choice to humiliate him. The only thing you did not anticipate was being wrong." Harmon looked toward the crowd, toward the phones that were still recording, toward the faces staring at him with open contempt. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Whitmore considered the question for a long moment. "That depends on Sergeant Calloway. He is the one you wronged. But I will tell you this much. Your contract with this memorial organization is terminated effective immediately. I will personally ensure that every veterans organization in this country knows exactly what happened here today. What you do with your life after that is your own concern." He turned his back on Harmon and walked away. At the base of the memorial wall, Ezra had finally risen to his feet, supported by Sarah and young Nolan on either side. Raymond stood nearby, wiping his eyes with the back of his weathered hand. Corporal Nguyen approached, her posture still formal, but her eyes soft with emotion. "Sergeant Calloway," she said, On behalf of everyone here who has ever served, I want you to know that what you did, what you endured, what you carried, it matters. You matter. Ezra looked at her, at the young soldier who had been the first to question what was happening, the first to notice that something was wrong with how he was being treated. You saw something, he said, at the barrier. When everyone else looked away, you kept looking. When, not that? I recognized your bearing, Sergeant. The way you stood, the way you held yourself, even when they were pushing you around. That is not something you can fake. That comes from somewhere deep. Ezra reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. Hold on to that instinct. It will serve you well. General Whitmore returned to the group. His confrontation with Harmon concluded. Sergeant Calloway, he said, I know this has been overwhelming, but there are things that need to happen. Paperwork, debriefings. Your status needs to be officially changed from MIA to returned. There are benefits you are entitled to. Medical care, housing, everything you should have had for the past 33 years. Ezra shook his head slowly. I did not come here for any of that. I know. Whitmore smiled gently. You came here to see the wall, to touch their names. But you deserve more than a life under a bridge. Your brothers would want more for you. Raymond stepped forward, clearing his throat. General, he said, I do not know all the protocols and procedures you military people have. But I know this man. I have shared a fire with him on cold nights. I have heard him crying out in his sleep. And I'm telling you right now that whatever you do next, you better do it right. Because Ezra Calloway has been failed by enough systems already. Whitmore nodded, respect evident in his expression. You served in Vietnam. Raymond straightened slightly. Eco. 1968 and 1969. Then you know exactly what I mean when I say that no veteran should ever have to sleep under a bridge. The general looked at both men. There's a program I work with. Not the VA. Something smaller. Run by people who understand what we went through. No bureaucracy. No paperwork piled to the ceiling. Just help, offered freely to those who need it. Ezra was quiet for a moment, processing the offer. His instinct was to refuse, to retreat, to disappear back into the shadows where he had lived for so long. But Sarah's hand was in his, and young Nolan was looking at him with eyes full of hope. And Raymond was standing beside him like the brother he had become. I do not know how to do this, Ezra said finally. I do not know how to be alive again. Sarah squeezed his hand. You do not have to know. You just have to let us help. Young Nolan nodded. One step at a time, Grandpa. That is all anyone can do. Ezra looked at the wall one more time. At Nolan Birch's name, carved at the top. At his own name, carved at the bottom. They would have to change that inscription now. Remove the MIA. Remove the presumed dead. Replace it with something else. Returned. Survived. Found. He did not know which word they would choose. Did not know what the official record would say. But he knew what Nolan would say if Nolan were standing beside him right now. He could almost hear that familiar voice, that crooked grin, those words that had haunted him for 33 years. Get home. Tell them we did not quit. Ezra had turned away from the wall and faced his daughter, his granddaughter, his friend, the general who had crossed a plaza to claim him, the young corporal who had seen him when no one else would. Okay, he said. The word came out rough, uncertain, like a muscle that had not been used in decades. Okay, I will try. Sarah wrapped her arms around him again. That is all we are asking, Dad. Just try. And for the first time in 33 years, Ezra Calloway believed that trying might actually be enough. 6 weeks later, the leaves had turned gold and red, carpeting the walkways of Valor Memorial Plaza in colors that seemed impossible after so many years of gray. Ezra walked slowly along the stone path, his limp still pronounced, but his gait steadier than it had been in decades. The new boots Sarah had bought him were properly fitted, cushioning the leg that had healed wrong in a prison cell 33 years ago. The jacket he wore was warm and clean, a gift from young Nolan who had insisted her grandfather needed something without holes. He still looked like a man who had been through hell. The scars on his hands would never fade. The missing tip of his left pinky would never grow back. The lines carved into his face by decades of suffering would remain until the day he died. But something in his eyes had changed. Raymond walked beside him, matching his pace, his own new jacket bearing a small Marine Corps pin that Corporal Nguyen had given him at the ceremony 6 weeks ago. The two old men had left the bridge together, moved into the transitional housing General Whitmore had arranged, and begun the slow process of learning how to live indoors again. It was not easy. Some nights Ezra still woke up screaming, still clawed at walls that were not there, still called out names that belonged to men who had been dead for 3 decades. But now when he woke, there was a roof over his head instead of stars, a bed beneath him instead of concrete, and a phone on the nightstand with his daughter's number programmed into it, ready to answer no matter what time he called. They reached the Operation Silent Thunder panel and stopped. The wall looked different now. Not physically, not yet. The stonemasons were scheduled to come next month to make the official changes. But Ezra knew what those changes would be. His name would remain, but the inscription would be altered. Staff Sergeant Ezra Calloway, Mia 1991. Returned 2024. Returned. Such a simple word for such a complicated journey. He reached out and touched Nolan's name, tracing the letters as he had done 1,000 times before. But this time, in the daylight, with Raymond beside him and the weight of the past 6 weeks settling into something almost like peace, the touch felt different. I kept my promise, he said quietly. Finally, 3 days after the ceremony, Ezra had sat in Rebecca Birch's living room, holding the brass compass that had belonged to her husband. She was in her 70s now, her hair silver, her hands spotted with age. But her eyes were still sharp, and when she looked at Ezra, she did not see the man who had survived when her husband had not. She saw the man who had carried her husband's memory for 33 years. He talked about you, she had said, taking the compass from his trembling hands and pressing it back into them. Before every deployment, he talked about you. Said you were the best soldier he ever knew. Said he trusted you with his life. I failed him, Ezra had whispered. Rebecca had shaken her head firmly. You survived him. There is a difference. And you came back. After all this time, you came back to tell me what happened. That is not failure. That is love. Nolan Jr. had been there too. A man in his 30s now, with his father's crooked grin and his mother's gentle eyes. He had not known what to say at first. How do you greet the man who held your father as he died? How do you thank someone for carrying a burden that was never theirs to carry? In the end, he had simply embraced Ezra and held on for a long time. Keep the compass, he had said when they finally separated. Dad gave it to you. He wanted you to have it. And now I am telling you the same thing. Keep it. Get home. That is what it is for. Ezra's hand moved to his chest, with a compass hung on a new chain next to his dog tags. 2 sets of tags still. His and Nolan's. He would carry them until the day he died. Raymond cleared his throat, pulling Ezra back to the present. You ready? He asked. Ezra nodded. They turned away from the wall and walked toward the small gathering waiting at the edge of the plaza. Sarah and young Nolan, General Whitmore and Corporal Nguyen, a handful of veterans from the Transitional Housing Program who had heard Ezra's story and wanted to meet the man who had finally come home. And in the center of the group, a young soldier in desert camouflage, barely 20 years old, with eyes that held the particular weight of someone who had recently returned from deployment. General Whitmore had asked Ezra to speak with him. The young man was struggling. Nightmares. Isolation. The same spiral Ezra had fallen into 33 years ago. Ezra approached him slowly, reading the tension in his shoulders, the distance in his eyes, the way he held himself apart from the group as if he did not belong. What's your name, son? Ezra asked. Private First Class Marcus Webb, sir. The young man's voice was flat, rehearsed. Recently returned from Afghanistan. Ezra nodded, looked at the wall behind them, looked back at the young soldier who reminded him so much of himself. I spent 33 years under a bridge, Ezra said. 33 years punishing myself for surviving when better men died. I thought I was honoring them by suffering. Thought I owed them my pain. He reached out and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. I was wrong. The dead do not want our suffering. They want us to live, to carry their memory forward, to build something with the time they gave us. Marcus's jaw tightened. He was fighting tears, fighting the walls he had built, fighting the same battle Ezra had lost for 3 decades. I do not know how, Marcus whispered. Ezra squeezed his shoulder. Neither did I, but I had people who refused to give up on me. And now I'm going to refuse to give up on you. That is how this works. We carry each other. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, some of the tension left his shoulders. Okay, he said. The word was uncertain, fragile, but it was a beginning. Ezra smiled. It was a strange sensation, smiling. He had not done much of it in 33 years. But standing here, surrounded by family and friends and fellow veterans, with the names of his brothers carved in stone behind him and a future stretching out ahead, he found that smiling came easier than he expected. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that second chances are possible and that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places, please subscribe to our channel. And share in the comments below, who is the quiet hero in your life that deserves recognition? Sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones still in uniform. They're the ones who keep fighting long after the war is over. Thank you for watching. Sarah took his arm as the group began to disperse. Ready to go home, Dad? She asked. Ezra looked at her, at young Nolan, at Raymond, at the wall bearing 6 names of brothers gone and 1 name of a brother returned. He thought of the compass against his chest, of Nolan's last words in that wadi, of the promise he had finally kept after 33 years. Get home. Tell them we did not quit. Yeah, he said. His voice was steady now, calm, almost whole. I am ready. And Staff Sergeant Ezra Calloway, the man who had been dead for 33 years, walked out of the Memorial Plaza and into the rest of his life. Still here, brothers. Still carrying you. And finally, after all this time, I am home.